Welcome to the Celebrity Estates Wills of the Rich and Famous podcast. In this podcast, we break down high-profile celebrity estate planning cases for advisors and their clients. Most celebrity estate catastrophes are based on the same issues that everyday people face, just with the volume turned up. Our goal is to identify and extract the individual estate planning issues that lie at the heart of each story. We then discuss what advisors should expect and how to avoid common pitfalls. Hosted by WealthManagement.com Senior Editor David Lenok.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of WealthManagement.com's Celebrity Estates, Wills of the Rich and Famous. For anyone new to the podcast, in each installment, myself and a guest take on a different celebrity estate and attempt to extract some key lessons that planners can apply to their more traditional clients. The idea being that celebrity estate planning stories, although often ridiculous in their details, generally have at their cores very basic issues that could just as easily apply to non-famous or fabulously wealthy clients. To learn more about estate planning and how you can better serve your clients, visit wealthmanagement.com/trusts-estates. Our monthly journal features tax law updates, wealth planning, retirement planning, and much more, written by thought leaders in the industry. That's wealthmanagement.com/trusts-estates. Now, we're joined this time by one of our favorite recurring guests, Jackie Bevilaqua. Jackie's a partner at Warshaw Burstein, and she's focused her practice on trust and estates law since 2013. She has a strong background in estate planning and estate and trust administration for a diverse clientele and significant experience with complex issues of gift, estate, and trust taxation. She also has significant experience in international estate planning, as well as Forward Account Tax Act compliance and pre-immigration tax planning. Thanks so much for joining us again.
Of course,
Jackie.
good to be here, Dave.
Now, the subject of today's episode is beloved actor Gene Hackman. In a legendary career spanning over 4 decades, he played such indelible roles as Detective Popeye Doyle in The French Connection, the villainous Sheriff Little Bill Daggett in Unforgiven, and Coach Norman Dale in Hoosiers. He received countless accolades, including 2 Academy Awards, 2 British Academy Film Awards, and 4 Golden Globes. Sadly, Hackman, who suffered from Alzheimer's later in his life, passed under bizarre circumstances in February at the age of 95. He and his wife and primary caretaker, pianist Betsy Arakawa, her 65, were both found dead, likely for weeks, in the home they shared. According to forensic experts, the couple likely died about a week apart. An investigation determined that Arakawa died on or around February 11th from hantavirus, pulmonary syndrome, a very rare disease that is spread by infected rat droppings or saliva. And Hackman was believed to have died on February 18th from heart disease with complications from Alzheimer's. It's all according to the Associated Press. Hackman reportedly left about $80 million of his estate to Arakawa, who was named in his will as successor trustee, this being California. They use revocable trusts. Arakawa's will, in turn, designates her assets to a trust to be distributed to charitable organizations and the settlement of medical debts. Now, Hackman and Arakawa, who were married since '91, had no children together, but Hackman is survived by 3 adult children from his previous marriage to Faye Maltese, though their relationship was strained and featured an extended estrangement, which reportedly had only recently began being mended. Where these children fit into the estate, if at all, sort of remains up in the air. Gene Hackman's tragic end is most aging people's worst nightmare. Effectively, his wife and caretaker passed, and unable to take care of himself and lacking the capacity even to go for help, Hackman followed about a week later. He lived in the same house as his deceased wife for an entire week. The more you think about it, the more upsetting the whole situation becomes. As advisors, part of our job is to ensure as best we can that our clients don't share Hackman's ignominious fate or something similar. Jackie, what are some of the challenges of working with older clients, particularly those that may be in cognitive decline?
Sure, Dave. Well, one of the things we come up against is how does someone with limited capacity, though still the capacity to understand the disposition of their assets, move forward with changing or updating an estate plan? It's certainly not as easy as sending a younger client or someone with full capacity drafts of documents with a summary and leaving it in their court. So I think it's just the challenge lies in directing the follow through and making sure that drafts are actually executed, and also making sure that someone truly understands their plan rather than that person is sort of throwing up their hands and trusting you.
Yeah, and earning that trust can be difficult. You might have to re-earn it, especially with someone who's in cognitive decline who may not remember may not remember if they have given up some powers of attorney, say. They may not remember having done that, or even who they've given it to.
Sure, absolutely. And also, my first draft of an estate plan is sort of an approximation of wishes if we've just had one or two conversations. So there are a lot of details that need to be hashed out. And I really need my clients, especially high net worth clients, to consider what I've drafted for them, not just to rubber stamp it. I find that it's often easier in person with older clients or clients who are experiencing cognitive decline, because it's a more personable environment, makes it easier to ask questions. And also, I can tell if someone doesn't understand something by the look on their face. If we're just having a phone call, if we're communicating over email, and they're saying that they understand something, I can't necessarily tell if they still have some misgivings about it, but they're just not necessarily feeling comfortable about discussing all of those with me.
And that, this idea of understanding is sort of particularly relevant because a lot of times we're dealing with documents that even people with their full cognition don't fully understand and will lie to you about it.
Sure, absolutely. And I think that people often don't want to go through the hassle of parsing through the documents page by page. Now, my summaries, I tend to break them down into sort of what's statutory, what's the legalese, and what are the true dispositive provisions. So you have to read the entire thing, but if you want to focus on where your estate is going, I pull that out and I tell you, these are the articles, these are what they say in sort of layman's terms. And I definitely like to go through that with my clients and make sure not just that the right people are getting assets, but that they're getting them in the right way. So are outright distributions appropriate? Are trust provisions appropriate? And which ones for which people? So, I try to take that first draft as like an opening offer and not as something that we should be taking to the signing table.
Yeah, and that idea of it being the first draft, and even once it's signed, these are living documents. It's not meant to be just stuck in a drawer and put away. So,
sure.
That's a difficult thing to come back over and, get this client back to the table over and over again, especially as they decline a bit. I mean, I believe Hackman's will was executed in 2005. So that's 20 years ago. God knows, a lot can change, especially with an older person like that. Drastically, your situation can change in 20 years.
Right. And I haven't seen his estate plan. I believe, from some of the articles I read, it indicated that he had a revocable trust. So perhaps he just had a pour over will and had been updating or at least, checking in on his revocable trust. But I really don't know. And it sounds like his circumstances changed sort of drastically towards the end of his life.
Yeah. And I think, you just said, the phrase end of life. And I think that's sort of one of the key issues here, right, for planners to sort of wrap their heads around and to really, I guess planners understand, really make sure clients wrap their heads around that, there is estate planning where, which most people think, just, my will, my trust, who gets what, but there is also end of life planning, which plays just as important a role and which, estate planning attorneys should be highly involved with.
Right, absolutely. It's our job to flag issues for people. So all of us know to flag tax issues that someone's not seeing. If someone brings up disposition of assets and you see a large amount of built-in gain, that's not necessarily going to get a step up for one reason or another. Every estate planning attorney knows to flag that. One of the things that I'm learning in my practice, and part of this is just the changing demographics of the people I represent, but I find more and more of my clients are single people living alone. So, New York City, where I primarily practice, though I also work in Connecticut, but New York City has one of the highest, if not the highest proportion of people living alone. So individual, sort of one person households. It creates a challenge for people in that even if you have resources that are more than abundant to meet your lifetime needs, including if you need round the clock care, you don't necessarily have that logical choice to put in charge of your care. And I think that there is a response. So there are bonded fiduciaries. There are people who can serve as your healthcare agent for a fee. There are people who can, serve as your power of attorney. There's obviously always been, corporate trustees. But how do you find those people? And are there enough for everyone? Right now, there's certainly, if you have enough money, you can pay for anything. But what about people who have $1 million, $5 million? We need to respond to this, I think, as a society and as a culture, that people are aging differently, and many people are aging either alone or alongside people who are the same age, right? So they don't have sort of that typical next generation to step in and manage their needs.
Yeah, and that's really what happened here, right? Hackman's wife, Betsy Arakawa, was much younger, but she was still 65. Now, 65 nowadays is not particularly old, but we're still into retirement age people where them dying of natural causes, or in this case a weird rat-borne disease, which probably speaks volumes to sort of how they may have been living. It's not so uncommon. So you sort of get into a question of who cares for the caretakers here.
Right, absolutely. And you mentioned this, but Gene Hackman was for a time estranged from his children, so he had someone significantly younger than he was caring for him, but there was no backup plan in place, obviously. There was no sort of daily check-in on the couple, not just on him. And that's certainly something, if you are a person's only caregiver and you live in a remote location like that, and you can go weeks without seeing a person, what are the checks and balances to make sure that you're okay every day?
Mm-hmm. And this is one of those topics, especially where you're looking at it in sort of the postmortem. I guess that's like a terrible choice of words, but let's go with it. And looking at it in the postmortem, a lot of this seems obvious, right? Where, of course you need these things. We don't need someone to tell us this, but these things need to be set up in advance. Sort of, if you're trying to set up this stuff, when at the time that you need it, it's like it's way too late already. Mm-hmm. So, and getting people into the headspace to think about these ideas when they're still younger and not afflicted can be, quite a challenge. How do you get clients to sort of wrap their heads around that sort of thing?
Well, I think I just flag issues for people, and I don't think people are so resistant as sometimes they just don't have the logical person in place to help them.
Yeah.
So, making those connections where I can with different organizations, or like I said, bonded fiduciaries is important. But I do think there's a need as well. I can't say that everyone's needs are fully met by the services available on the market today. So is there something like an app that could be created where you check in every day, and if you don't, someone's alerted? It doesn't have to be the police, but maybe Betsy Arakawa's hairdresser was speaking to the police about the circumstances of her passing. So, maybe an acquaintance is the next person. Or do you have someone who just calls you every day for a monthly fee and makes sure everything is okay? Because, I'm sure they had a security system and the ability to call for help, but it sounds like Betsy's passing was sudden. And then Gene didn't have the know-how or the whatever capacity he needed to call for help.
Yeah, and that really is the nightmare scenario. At this point, I think the best bet for a lot of people is trying to sort of cobble together some combination of sort of other technologies, be it smartphones, smart houses, your sort of Ring doorbells, these sorts of things, where the sort of what you might find intrusive, as a younger person, as an older person, can maybe make a big deal, a big difference in sort of helping others notice that something's going on, or helping you get help if you're sort of in a position where you can't get out the door.
Right. And they have sort of social programs for this, right? Like places where elderly people can go for lunch. And that's affordable for everyone, but it's not necessarily a cost-saving measure so much as a socializing measure. They have like adopt a grandparent programs where you can get matched with an older person who could use a younger person in their life. But what about the practicalities of it? And not even necessarily talking about like a professional to act for you, but just a person to be aware of and involved in your life to a very limited degree, just to make sure that everything's copacetic, that you're okay.
Yeah, it is. Having friends seems like such a as a banal sort of explanation, but it really does make a difference. I know, personal anecdote that, I know someone who's going through, sadly through loss of capacity, and she's a widow. And, the person, it's just her random friends from Temple, and that happen to, catch on when something's going on with her. And they're the ones, who, she hasn't showed up in a week, better, call the family. And it's funny how sort of, just even acquaintances, like these aren't lifelong friends. These are just people who notice that she's not there.
Yeah.
And that's made a big deal in sort of, getting her, keeping her sort of on track and keeping the family abreast of just when she's starting to get a little off.
Sure. Sure. And it depends for everyone. Obviously, friends are great, but people tend to be friends with people in the same age cohort. Yeah. So it's about keeping people who are of a different generation. Not that you need to have younger friends, but what can fill in if you don't have nieces, nephews, children? What's the relationship there? And some people are lucky, and it's sort of like a building by building basis, right? Like some buildings, neighbors are very involved in one another's lives. Some buildings you wouldn't notice if someone doesn't leave their apartment for a week.
Moving on from the elder law topics into just a little more of the mechanics of estate planning, you don't often see a husband and wife die this close in proximity without dying at the same time, kind of without like there being some sort of other, like an auto accident or God forbid something else. So how, do you mind just like walking through, I guess, how, if, the timeline is correct here, just how the estates would work, like what would happen in terms of, a husband who dies a week before his wife, not necessarily Gene Hackman, but just any husband who dies and then his wife dies a week later?
So without some sort of a provision in his documents, I imagine his trust or his will says, I leave my estate as follows. If my wife survives me, to my wife or in certain proportions, and then if my wife does not survive me. So then there's the issue of she survived him by a week. I believe the New Mexico state law where they passed away provides that because he survived her for a week, that's end of the story, she predeceased. But in my documents, I don't have language for a week. I have something like if, we die at the same time, this is who's deemed to survive. If I imagine he had this in his documents, and it probably says Betsy was deemed to have survived him just based on her age and, their difference in wealth, but also is 7 days the amount of time that's in his documents. It's, some people use 30 days, 60, 90 days, something like that. So, and then a lot of estate plans between couples are not like a winner takes all, as if the surviving spouse distributes everything according to their wishes, but it can be. So, potentially Gene Hackman's children could be his successor beneficiaries, and that could leave Betsy Arakawa's family members out in the cold, essentially, from a distribution that they would have received under different circumstances.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of taxation, if things are, would be changing hands, there would be two separate transfers here, right? Like presuming, that it was an amount that would be worthy of taxation, obviously. Would it be basically taxed twice, even though it was such a short time in between the two transfers?
So to the extent it's includable in both of their estates, it could be taxed twice. I mean, one would get a marital deduction, right, for anything that's going to their surviving spouse, but it certainly takes out a lot of the ability to do any post-mortem planning. So obviously, you're not going to have the same flexibility of disclaiming and, moving forward like that. Obviously, your fiduciary can act on your behalf with that, but it really complicates things. We do try to plan for this issue of simultaneous death, but it's also not necessarily expected. So I think where it's come up in Gene Hackman's estate and where it's been sort of most, egregious is that his fiduciaries have passed away. He didn't have successor fiduciaries. Either, he named Betsy and someone else who's passed away already, but I did read that none of his fiduciaries are still living. And a lot of people will come to me and say, well, my spouse is the only person I want acting in this capacity. And I do really try to push back against that because people do, though not frequently, it's certainly not unheard of for a couple to die in a common accident.
Mm-hmm. And I believe in most states, there's also just a blanket, like, I think it's 5 days. In a lot of states where, if a couple, if a pair dies within 5 days of another, it's automatically considered simultaneous death.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So in that, in this case, in Gene Hackman's specific case, we have the medical examiner saying about a week. Now, about a week and 5 days could be pretty close to one another, depending. Sure. So that's the thing, maybe to keep an eye on here.
Well, then there's also, there's certainly the possibility of litigation on that point, because I think it has to do with how long Gene Hackman's pacemaker was, sending signals or, receiving electrical activity. But does that mean he hadn't passed away? I don't know. I feel like where there's a will, there's a way. If someone wants to make an argument that he passed away earlier, I think that the pacemaker information may not necessarily be dispositive. All that to say, if a claim to the contrary is made, it might survive summary judgment.
Yeah, the pacemaker thing is a really interesting point, where it's almost like the inverse of the sort of the when is a fetus a person idea. Like, when is a person dead? When, like I said, a dead body can still receive electrical signals. It's like still be an excellent conductor. So, are we going to define whether someone's alive if all the evidence we have is based entirely on pacemaker signals? Like, what does that mean? So that is really like an interesting quirk in sort of what is already sort of a weird story.
Now, I don't believe Betsy Arakawa had children of her own, so perhaps this estate could avoid that kind of litigation. Obviously, if she had kids and he had kids, and if there was going to be a significantly different disposition of assets based on who survived the other, that could be a really messy litigation. But, it remains to be seen if we will avoid litigation in this case. I think, what I read was she had charitable beneficiaries, but, it's not unheard of for a charity to litigate to get its portion of an estate.
Yeah, when it's $80 million, you're talking about people in seemingly, quote unquote, normal estates will come up with all sorts of reasons to litigate. So in one where there's this many unusual facts and different angles and uncertainties, I feel like litigation is almost guaranteed here, but obviously who knows?
Remains to be seen.
Well, that's about all the time that we have for today. I'd love to thank Jackie Bevilaqua for coming on and being a great guest and sort of speculating with me about this, sort of tragic tale and sort of trying to, draw some lessons out of this awful thing that happened. Thanks so much for coming on, Jackie.
Thanks, Dave. Always nice to speak with you.
And to all our listeners, I'll see you, or I guess you'll hear me, on the next episode of Celebrity Estates, Wills of the Rich and Famous.
Thank you for listening to the Celebrity Estates Wills of the Rich and Famous podcast. Click the subscribe button below to become notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Informa WealthManagement.com. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment planning.